to welcome Dean Svoboda to the stage, as he will be introducing our next keynote speaker. Dean is the founder and executive director of Autism Asperger Friendship Society of Calgary, or AFS. Early in his journey, Dean noticed that although autistic youth's most common challenge was the social and recreational world, there were no programs that made social and recreational development the number one priority, and oftentimes they were losing their recreation and playtime as a consequence of therapy. Therefore, AFS is driven to build relationships, experience, and acceptance. Dean is known as a public speaker, coach, fundraiser, program developer, friendship maker, and advocate for those who fall outside what most would accept as the norm. He has been awarded the Donald Norman Memorial Award for Outstanding Contribution to Disability Arts and Culture, is a Beth Drews Scholarship recipient, winner of Social Ventures Partners Fast Pitch, and was named GQ Man of the Year. Oh, sorry, I read that wrong. I mean, Avenue Magazine's Top 40 Under 40 in 2013.
Well, that's quite an introduction for just to do an introduction. Thanks, Amy. I'm really excited to meet, to introduce Courtney. I met her years ago at a conference in Long Beach and watched some of the work she's done from afar. It had admiration for a long time. And we were in the midst of planning this conference. I noticed a post on Courtney's Facebook about being in India presenting, and then a week later, the world went into COVID. So that was a fun time to be in India, I'm sure. Courtney received her doctorate in psychology from the Marriage and Family Therapy Program at Alliant International University in San Diego, California. Dr. Olinger is committed to sharing and supporting effective mental health work with autism. Since 2000, Dr. Olinger has worked with autistic children, adolescents, and adults aged 18 months to 70 years old of all abilities. She is a published author, international speaker, has served as adjunct faculty at Alliant International University and San Diego State University. She has served as founder director of a nonprofit ASD agency, Respectrum Community, which provided recreation, social, educational, and psychotherapeutic services, and later became the Autism and Mental Health Services team for San Diego Center for Children. She was the executive director of family counseling at Cortica, a neurology healthcare clinic, and currently maintains a private practice, Respect Family Therapy and Counseling, where she focuses primarily on working with autistic and LGBTQI plus mental health experiences. She also has a great partner and two beautiful kids. So welcome, Courtney Olinger.
I don't know how to maneuver this. I wanted to have water in case I need it later, but yeah, that's great. Thank you. All right. So thank you so much, Dean, and everyone else for having me here today. I've been very excited to be able to be here, but this is also the first time I'm speaking in person for over 2 years. So I'm finding I'm a bit with the nerves right now. Let me get started with sharing my presentation. Okay. So I don't know about you all, but when I'm in spaces where I don't feel like I can be myself, or I'm not able to be who I am, I feel weird. It doesn't feel so good. And if this is really pervasive in my life, it feels pretty awful. And yet, this is what I often hear from a lot of my autistic clients. I hear sentiments like this one. I was told by medical and psychological professionals, teachers, friends, and family that in many ways I am too much or weird. For so long, I internalized these opinions that wanted me to dampen who I am, which led to loneliness, greater anxiety, depressive episodes, and ultimately helped fuel suicidal ideations. Today, I'm here to share my journey and my learnings as a marriage and family therapist working alongside autistic individuals. When I think about why mental health has become so important to me, I think back to a conversation I had with a parent who was volunteering with my organization back in the year 2010. She said to me at the time something along the lines of, "No one really knows that mental health is important for kids with autism. They just want their kids to be able to make friends, communicate effectively, and not have behaviors. It was disheartening to hear this, but it was sadly true within the autism community and the field. And even today, when there's more research that shows that there are higher rates of mental health challenges among the autistic population, I still see that there is not a great focus on mental health. And even more so, most of what people call mental health focus is actually much more behaviorally focused. I'm really glad that I'm going after Dr. Jonathan Weiss today because I am not a researcher, so he did a great job of outlining some of the research. And I was even more relieved because when I saw that there were two people talking about mental health, I was concerned we were going to say some very different things, and thankfully we will not. We even might have one of the same pictures in our slides. So we need to understand that the lack of attention to an autistic person's well-being leads that person many times to significant mental health distress. I know this from experience, as the year 2010 was also the year that my little brother at the age of 17 died by suicide. So I first want to start by talking about what my definition of mental health is. I very much appreciated the definitions that we saw earlier. I like to think of mental health as emotional, relational, and internal well-being, where the internal part includes how our body is working, including the many processes that allow our body to function and give information about our experiences, such as through the brain and central nervous system. The internal part can be affected by sleep and nutrition, how our physiological, physical, and sensory processes are working, and how we experience the world around us. It also includes how we internalize social processes. That is, how we're affected by social interactions and social expectations. In my work with autistic individuals, we are constantly exploring these three areas and the ways in which they impact one another. So as I mentioned, I'm a clinician, not a researcher, not an academic. And I'd like to share a little more about my journey, some of which you heard Dean speak about today. I've had my foot in many different areas related to autism since the year 2000, initially in behavioral work, then with my brother's diagnosis, my dissertation, a great deal of work in school settings, running social skills groups and recreation programs, working in a community mental health care clinic, and then later a neurology healthcare clinic. And currently, I'm in private practice and consulting with many organizations across the United States. Since the year 2006, I have been much more interested in mental health. And I have to admit, initially, my focus on mental health, like for many, was more focused on what was going on for family members. But suddenly, I got all of these calls from parents that were looking for mental health support for their children, some of whom I'd worked with years earlier in behavioral work. What I noticed is that there was a growing awareness that in these children that often led to greater anxiety, depression, and suicidality. Kids that I had worked with who had been blissfully in their own heads were now overwhelmed by the social environment, comparison to others, what others expected of them, and how they internalized it all. Usually as I'm bad, something's wrong with me. And even worse, I heard many of these kids had been told directly by their schools and sometimes interventions that they were not acceptable or that something was wrong with them. Again, often internalizing it as they themselves were not acceptable. Throughout my professional journey, I learned the most from the autistic children, adolescents, and adults that I've worked with, and I'm still learning. The spirit of what I do is built on participatory action research, or PAR principles, engaging the participants as co-researchers, uncovering community local knowledge, and creating action within and among the community around what they find most important and valuable. This PAR metaphor has guided my work initially during my dissertation with parents, and eventually within my clinical work with autistic individuals. PAR aligns with narrative practices, the therapy model from which I most closely align, where the therapist listens from a place of genuine curiosity and a sense that the client is the expert in their own lives. Of utmost importance is keeping the lived experience center to the process. A lot of my work has been letting go of what I thought I knew or what allistic or non-autistic voices claim is quote unquote normal or right. I am metaphorically a co-researcher alongside my clients where we are co-discovering what is meaningful to them. Narrative practices will speak of this as the therapist being decentered but influential, where my knowledge and my experiences are brought into the room to discover with the client what best fits so that their voices can remain centered and their ideas privileged. A central idea related to narrative practices is that we experience our lives as a set of stories, and narrative therapy has to do with restoring our identity and our relationship to the problems we experience. A guiding belief is the problem, the person is not the problem. But often people get talked about and thought about as if they are the problem, and then they internalize this. I am actively working with my clients to separate their ideas from the problem, their identities from the problem. So how do I do this? I'm often asked when I do talks like this, how I go about engaging my autistic clients in therapy. Because as we know, there are many different communication styles, many different ways that autistic individuals show up in a room with another person, and there can be some barriers to therapy. I firmly believe that most therapeutic interventions can be used with autistic people. They may just need different engagement strategies and supports in order to render therapy accessible. The examples I'm going to share today are going to highlight my work coming from more aligned with narrative practices, but I do believe that using engagement strategies can help with all sorts of therapy modalities, and I hope that these can be helpful across the wide variety of programs that you are each working within. In order to support engagement, I pay attention to what I call input, output, and processing, the very non-research-based definitions. So what is input? Input is what we take in, usually through our sensory systems. It's the information that we perceive through our senses. Some examples of challenges with input can be seen when spoken language, especially questions, are overwhelming, or if there's distress experience with too much visual or auditory stimulus. Thank you for dimming the lights today. That was very, very bright earlier. I don't know about you all, but I was noticing that the input was getting in the input of the visual stimulus was getting in the way of some of the ways I was showing up today. So limiting what stimulus the person has to process can help the client to effectively attend and participate. Often visual input is preferred, and sensory strategies and breaks can help regulate the body and mind to be able to access therapy. It's important that you explore with each specific client what is helpful for them. So one example, I worked with a young boy for several years. He started with me when he was about 9 years old. And he would come into my office where I had a couch and beside it a little side table. And he would often crawl under that little side table next to the couch when he was overwhelmed by the auditory stimulus in the room, or if he perceived the content of our conversation to be too difficult. So I would take the couch cushions and I would put them around that side table to reduce any further stimulation. And I would write on a whiteboard, "You can join us when you're ready," just putting it out of his reach, but in sight for him to see it. He even came up with a plan along the way for how he could tell me at what point of regulation he was at. He asked for a red, yellow, and green piece of construction paper. And I learned very quickly that if I saw the red, it meant he was absolutely not ready. If there was red and yellow, it meant he was starting to feel a little bit better and a bit more regulated in his body and mind. If I saw the green and yellow, I knew we were getting closer, but not quite yet there. And then the green piece of construction paper would come out and he would emerge from under the table and be able to participate for the rest of the session. Gradually over time, the amount of time that he spent under that table reduced till eventually he didn't need to retreat under the table at all. And so this was a really important example for me to show that we need to work at our autistic clients' time and pace and find the ways that they can become accommodated to our environment and do whatever we can to support them. With processing, in this sense, I'm speaking about what we do with the information that has just been input, or how we make meaning and how we connect to other information and memories. Some autistic individuals have delays in processing and need a bit more time to make meaning or draw on their previous experience and knowledge. I find that clinicians often make the mistake of continuing on, not allowing enough silence to support processing. I have learned over the years to become more comfortable with silence, and I attribute this learning to one of the clients I had years ago, who on good days, his processing time was about 20 seconds, but on some days he would come in and it would take up to about a minute before I would get a response. A minute is a really long time, and I was incredibly uncomfortable with this, but I learned to negotiate my own comfort and anxiety so that he could best participate. I also then noticed that if I was giving him time to process and I was also taking notes, that this would further disrupt the processing. So I had to sit not only in silence, but in still silence. It was a great practice for me, and one that has been so useful for many clients that I work with since. With that particular client, about 80% of the time after I sat still in silence, I would get a response. The other 20% of the time, he would realize I was waiting and then ask me to repeat the question. Sometimes with processing challenges, a person is making connections that are not intended. So I'm reminded of one of the sayings that my narrative mentors used to say all the time about the therapy process: go slow. This helped with my work with autistic individuals to slow myself down and find a pace that worked for them as we broke down concepts, defined what we were both meaning, checked in with one another, reviewed and connected to what we were focusing on and other aspects of our work. In this way, we are negotiating the therapeutic process and the ways we relate to one another, rather than me assuming they need to follow my neuronormative interaction patterns. I recently read a quote by Finn Grattan, who is an autistic non-binary therapist and has written a book on supporting transgender and autistic individuals. And this quote perfectly summed up how I think about this processing dance that we do. Any failures in understanding are not the result of deficits in the autistic person, but in two-way difficulties in our ability to communicate. So output is how we get information that we processed or stored out into the world, usually through speaking, writing, drawing, creating, displaying, or expressing. It is more evident when there are output challenges such as not speaking or not writing, but this can also be when nonverbal communication is perplexing or mismatched. Making therapy accessible means being creative with modes of communication and finding ways that the client can best express themselves. My clients on telehealth, so video chat that we do, often choose to chat their responses, and sometimes I list possible expressions for them to choose what most closely fits what they're trying to say. I am sure to include none of these as one of the choices, or sometimes something like close to one but not quite right, so that again we can further negotiate the language that will best express what they're trying to say, and they don't feel like they have to pick one of my choices. Utilizing engagement strategies allows for autistic clients to engage with me in many therapeutic ways. Narrative practices tells me that there's more to this story than the problem narrative, and my work with autistic individuals tells me that there's more to this story than autism as the problem. Through our interactions, discussions, drawings, and play, we are uncovering a lot about who the client is becoming and the identity they prefer. It requires a patient and intentional listening. I have learned to listen in different ways, and I have learned to listen to the silence as well. In our work together, I am learning what their understanding of autism is, what their unique autism profile is, and what questions they have. I need to know if there are any misconceptions about autism so we can dispel those. Throughout our work together, I am paying attention to their dislikes, gripes, and discomforts, as well as their interests and their preferences. These often connect to what is important to them and what they value. We speak about skills and challenges, the fact that everyone has them, and which ones might be associated with autism. Along with understanding their unique sensory processing, these tell us something about their experiences and how they are making sense of these experiences. We explore the ways that clients can honor the needs of their bodies and minds while paying attention to the ways they prefer to relate to others. We are co-discovering their preferred understanding of autism, and with this, a sense of agency. And all of this can be explored with both adults and autistic children alike. This is one quote after some time working with a client of mine. It has been really helpful to explore my sensory profile, different emotions, and how they feel to me. And for us to explore my autism spectrum diagnosis. Learning more about what it means to be autistic has helped me make sense of how my brain works and how to better cope with some of the struggles I face living in a neurotypical society. When addressing understandings of autism, I am cognizant for dispelling myths associated with what autism means or any sort of totalizing descriptions of the person. While we address the challenges associated, we are also discussing the qualities and attributes often associated with autistic individuals and which fit for the specific person. Through further explorations, the story that is unfolding as I listen, highlight, and document these aspects is one of a preferred identity, one in which autism is often a cherished part, even if it also comes with challenges. So central questions we are exploring are, who are you becoming? Because I believe that we are not stagnant beings and we're always growing. How do you want to show up in relationship with others? Making a distinction between preferences and what others expect. How can you navigate contexts which demand a lot of you? With this, it's not about changing the autistic person, but about helping them to connect more fully to who they are and their rights to be who they are in a world that still creates a lot of barriers. All of this exploration supports a shift towards agency, and if you haven't already guessed, agency is very important for mental health. As part of my narratively informed practice, I frequently utilize therapeutic documentation, where important themes from our work together are gathered to assist the client to re-story their narrative in more helpful and supportive ways. Therapeutic documentation is not a revision, therapeutic documentation can come in the form of a Word document, a note card with themes, a letter with reflection questions, cards that catalog successes. Recently, I did a Google Doc where we could both add their preferences. The restoring and the documentation is not a revision of history, but rather a shifting of the relationship that one has with their experiences, and most importantly, with the problem. Additionally, the visual aspect of rereading their own words The accumulation of knowledge and the skill that they hold is what most of my clients report as being one of their favorite parts of our work together and one of the most beneficial aspects. This client wrote, I found a therapist who actively listens to me and ultimately creates write-ups of what I had said. These write-ups reflect that I am stronger and nicer to myself than I previously thought. When I hear my words spoken back to me, I feel validated and I begin to understand myself better. Here is one example of work that I've done with somebody around values to explore preferred identity. I usually start by giving them a list of values words. So there's over 100 words on this page that we read through, and I ask them to pick out which words are important to them. Then we go through the words and we define them. Usually I want to find out first how they're thinking about the word. Sometimes they may be thinking about it in different ways than I've understood. So we'll look it up together and see what the definition is and if that word best fits. We often find that many of the words they choose are connected to one another. And so we'll go through the words to figure out which one do they want to put at the top of that group. And then we will engage in telling stories about our values. So I'll ask them to tell me a bit about when they first remember recognizing that this value was important to them. I'm going to ask them also if they've ever seen people in their lives that are living close to this value. Sometimes they're family members, sometimes they're social media influencers, sometimes they're people in books that they've read. But we're getting a really rich story about who they are and what's important to them as we're learning about the different characters in their lives and these different pieces of their stories. So with this particular client, I drew this picture of a person and I said to him, if all of your values lived inside of you and you stayed really close to these values, what would be possible for you, for your relationships, and for your future? And so you can see that he identified justice, authenticity, wisdom, learning, trustworthiness, empathy, honoring differences, and loyalty as his values. And the possibilities that exist were better future, better relationships, pursue more education, and internship. And this was just the beginning of our exploration, so there was more to come. I'm also working with my clients to critically evaluate, learn, and grow from social interactions. I am careful not to impose holistic or neuronormative ideas. We are spending time exploring different ways of interacting, engaging, sharing space, and being in relationship with one another, and then also with others. So the therapeutic process is the process of building relationship that they can very much learn from. Social rules are picked apart to learn more about where they came from, who they serve, and what ways they are helpful or unhelpful to the autistic person and others involved. And then most importantly, what do they want to do with all of this information? Okay. How do they want to show up in their relationships? Central to this exploration is deconstructing normal. One example would be a few years ago when I was working with a 16-year-old who really did not like the diagnosis and was really interpreting his diagnosis as meaning he was abnormal. I found this excerpt it's by Hutton and Knapp in a kit called Lost in Normality. And I read to him the following excerpt. The word normal originally comes from the Latin or French for carpenter's square or normal angle. So we may ask, what has the carpenter's square got to do with us? It was only in the early 19th century that the word normal began to be applied to people and their actions rather than just to angles. In recent times, a concept of what's normal or to be expected of most people can be applied to just about anything. We are judged on our height, weight, time taken to grieve, how angry or how happy we are, amongst a world of other things as detailed and varied as you can imagine. Ideas of normal women, normal men, and normal children abound and are constantly changing. Just think of what might be considered normal this season that might not have been last season. Our culture has developed a huge range of ways of measuring people's normality, and with this, their worth as a person. After I read that to this client, his eyes widened and he declared, "Everyone should read this." And so when I asked him why that was, he stated, "Because no one is normal." This was a turning point in our work together because we had an opportunity to really pick apart some of those normative ideas that had been influencing him to think that he was abnormal. And this is a great example of the work that I'm often doing with clients. It carved space out for him to be himself in ways that felt good and natural without feeling bound to the measurement of a carpenter's square. So I'm proposing that service providers think twice about what we are teaching and why we are teaching it. Are we reinforcing some sort of arbitrary norm? Recently, there's been more literature on masking. Trying to suppress or hiding one's autistic characteristics based on what society collectively says is normal has significant and negative impact on mental health. My message to my clients is you do not need to change who you are. It's important that while standing against masking, we also make a distinction between what is masking and what are relational skills that allow for the person to get their needs met, allow for them to nurture connections, allow for them to show up in ways that they prefer, and allow them to navigate not just one way to be in different social environments and with these different expectations. We have to honor and acknowledge who they are, and they need to know that this is okay. And you'd be surprised that this is really the cornerstone of a lot of the work that I'm doing with my clients, autism or not, is really thinking about it's okay to be who you are and really dispelling a lot of these social expectations that we're constantly up against. So some of the relating practices that we're working on are noticing. What are they noticing in their bodies? What are they noticing in their minds? What are they noticing around them in their environment and with others? Checking in with themselves and others. So some communication skills may be involved. There may be some nonverbal checks that are happening. Being able to share likes and dislikes. So speaking up about what is challenging or what they're uncomfortable about, and listening to others' discomforts and challenges, and then modifying. Ultimately, what I'm often asking is, what do you like or not like? What sort of difference does this make? And what are some other possibilities? So with youth and different communication styles, the process of restoring this narrative often starts with collecting stories about the times they were successful in keeping the problem from getting bigger. So a lot of the language I use with my younger clients is how we think about if the problem stayed the same size, if it got bigger, or if it got smaller. Ultimately, the goal is usually for the problem to at least stay the same size. And sometimes we get to the point where it gets smaller. So we're collecting these stories of the times that they are proud of something they did, skills that they used, or another time that somebody noticed that they were probably thinking through some sort of action. And these become a record of the knowledge and skills that the person holds. This is one example of a success strip that can be used. With these success strips, what I often do is co-create these with my clients, utilizing favorite colors to design them, and they get to choose what characters or images or sometimes photos of themselves go into the success strips. And then we recruit people in their lives, anywhere from parents to teachers, siblings, other service providers, to report the times where they've noticed them being successful. So what do I mean by success? And that's really important because I'm really looking for, again, the times that the problem didn't get bigger, not necessarily times the problem wasn't present or it was a perfect solution. In fact, sometimes it's even more helpful if we're finding a time where the problem didn't get better, but it didn't end up perfectly. right? Because then what we're able to do is we're able to gather that collective skill and knowledge that the client, the student, the young person is utilizing in those kind of more preferred ways. And I do want to mention this is an adaptation of Marie-Natalie Bourgeois' work, who's a narrative therapist out of San Francisco. So when we're looking for these successes, we're looking at intensity and duration. You know, was there something that was less intense? Did it last a little bit less long than it normally does? And those are going to be the times that we really want to explore and gather. With my young children, I still will always put words there because a lot of times, even if they can't read, they will remember the stories. And we may even draw pictures together or create a little booklet around them. So a couple examples of successes that I've experienced were the time that a client of mine was about to hit their mom and stopped. And so this was reported as a success. And we were able to talk about how this client actually prefers to be in relationship with their mother, right? It says a lot about who they are as a person and how they want to be in that relationship. Or the time that one of my clients picked up a very heavy, very full water bottle and was about to throw it at me. And instead, he unscrewed the cap and threw the water at me instead. Okay. So that was a moment where we were able to, the next day, not in that moment, but the next day, be able to reflect on, like, wow, you really knew something about danger and hurting people. What did you know about that? Right? You knew something, even in the face of anger. You knew that, and he was able to report to me, I don't want to hurt people. Okay. And this is somebody who had very much been described by others as aggressive and violent. Okay. That was a really important success for us to capture. So by paying attention to and documenting these successes, we shift the focus of the conversation to skills, abilities, and knowledge, thereby supporting a more whole and rounded view of the autistic person and cataloging a story that is not just about challenges and problems, but focusing on the emerging and developing skills connected to their preferred identity. Sentence starters can assist clients who have trouble with expressive language or finding their words in that moment. Sentence starters that get at preferences can be I like, I can, I'm proud of, it's helpful when, it's unhelpful when, or any variation of this. Obviously, the complexity of the sentence is going to be dependent on the person that you're working with. I've had very young children, again, who can't read, and I'm still writing these things out and then giving them pictures to choose from so that they can complete the sentence with a picture that best fits them. Some clients, if they can't just automatically verbalize a response, I will give choices of different words, sometimes a full page of words or phrases where they could possibly pick one. And again, I'm always including at least one of the choices, none of these, something else, or one close to one of those, but not quite right, so that we can negotiate what they're trying to say. And sometimes we get important characters, fictional or real, involved in the retellings. Recently, when one of my clients was struggling to answer my questions, we were able to recruit Optimus Prime of the Transformers to report to me the skills that my client had been using in the face of the problem. A few of the clients that I've worked with have done video game designs around existing with their skills and challenges, usually based on question prompts or sentence starters that I'm giving them. And these all can tell me a lot about their preferences, values, and skills. One of my clients has trouble describing situations, what he's thinking, what he's feeling. And so our sessions revolve around a series of comic strip drawings or timelines. With the comic strip drawings, I may know a certain detail, but he often has trouble telling me some of the sequencing of the events. And so we'll develop these comic strips where I'll fill in what I know about the situation, and then empty boxes where he can draw in what else was happening at the time, what he was thinking, how he was feeling, what the outcome was. I might add another box of what he would have liked to do instead. And he may or may not be able to describe it, but through the pictures, I can get a lot of detail. And oftentimes, just drawing it helps him put some words to his experience. With that same client, backing up one, well, we'll pretend that sad face isn't there. With that same client, the wavy line here is my depiction of a timeline. So I prefer a wavy line when we're describing a timeline because I want to see the ebb and flow of a relationship to something and not just some sort of linear thing. I let my clients choose if they want to do a wavy line all the way across the page or a zigzag or whatever they'd like it to look like. So with one of my clients recently, we were talking about the relationship to getting along with others. And so I started by having him think of a time where he got along with other kids. He was feeling good in that moment. How old was he in that moment? We plotted it on the timeline, and then I had him draw the picture. And I usually say, make sure you include faces and other people, and so I can see the setting. A lot of thought goes into these drawings. Then I asked him to think about one skill that he needed to have before getting along with others and when he thought he first developed that skill, and draw me some pictures of that skill on the timeline. And we did this for about 3 skills. And then I asked him, when was a time you didn't get along with others? Can you draw me a picture of that time and how you felt and who was there? Right? And then we talked about, now, if you're thinking about this time and all the skills that you have, what do you think is possible for your future? Can you draw that? Okay. So we get a lot of rich description about who this person is and what they know about how they want to show up with others. Oh, lost my presentation. What did I do? There. Is it still presenting on? Okay, good. All right, so with all of this, I'm on the outlook for times that those socially imposed expectations or the neuronormativity seeps in, because these can reinforce masking, which can have lasting effects on mental health. So an example, recently I was talking to another one of my clients who has challenges with losing. I'm sure you know some other autistic individuals that have some of these challenges. And when asking him what he knew about losing, he said to me, I should just smile and say good game. In that moment, it felt important for me to say, wait a minute, you weren't happy. Why would you want to smile? You don't have to smile if you're upset. A lot of people don't like losing. I am very competitive. I do not like losing. It is okay if you let people know that you're upset and you don't like losing, and then we can figure out how you want to be in relationship to others. An autistic person should never be held to a higher standard than anyone else, and it's okay to not like something or be upset. One's mental health experience is very much impacted by their sense of identity and how close or far they are from their own preferences, and what contexts support or deny this. We can truly support this when we become critical of neuronormativity and recognize there are many possibilities that exist. Part of this journey is assisting clients to connect to their own preferred identity, and this includes paying attention to experiences of systemic oppression. If we aren't asking about and listening to autistic voices and joining them on their journeys of discovery, we may be perpetuating a decline in their mental health by providing the message that their identity, and who they are is not okay. It feels silly to say this, but I know that for some allistic people, it comes as a surprise. Autistic people, and yes, this includes children, have many intersecting identities, and we have to pay attention to this. Most specifically, I am working more and more with autistic individuals who also are transgender. There's a lot of intersections between gender identity and autistic identity, and yet many things that I see in research, many assessments that I read, fail to even consider gender or gender identity. So that's one that I think is particularly important that we spend more time paying attention to. This is a quote from one of my clients after we'd spent a great deal of time working on scaffolding preferred identity development. I have made a purposeful effort to live my identity out loud. I now embrace parts of me that used to be unknown, perceived as shameful or criticized, I realized that coming out as autistic, asexual, queer, a survivor of rape, and nonconforming allowed for me to connect to so many people, gain professional opportunities, and love myself more. Being me has so many advantages I never knew could exist. Finding out who you are requires not only an active search on the individual's part, but also actively listening and validation on the community's part. All right, so I want to then just sum all of this up in terms of some aspects that I think are important when thinking about mental health across any services, assessment, research, anything that we're doing. First and foremost, consent, and for youth, assent, needs to be built into all programs and services and continuously gathered, both verbally and in expression, whether it be in medical services, behavioral speech, OT, assessment, education, and so on. The amount of medical trauma that my clients report is astounding. And I'm really excited to hear about a lot of things and see today a lot of the things that are happening in the medical community, because it really is something that is heartbreaking to hear and has such an impact on a person's well-being and their mental health. Secondly, autistic people should always be able to say no. I don't want to, I don't like this, or not yet, or something along those lines. If we're not first starting with the right to say no, there's more likelihood that mental health can suffer. Self-advocacy, the ability to speak up for oneself, and co-advocacy, recruiting allies to speak up for a person when they're not able to access their own communication skills, should be the foundation of all services and programs. If a person doesn't trust that they could say no, why should they say yes? All programs should evaluate sensory and social demands that are placed. Utilize autistic input through communities and consultation whenever possible. This has come up a lot of times today, which I'm very happy to hear about. Consider ways to modify environment and expectations, and also simultaneously support autistic individuals to navigate discomfort without reaching meltdown. We often talk about knowing one's own limitations and knowing what their window of discomfort is so that they don't get to that point of meltdown, but understanding that part of the process is learning to navigate some discomfort, utilizing multiple skills and strategies such as mindfulness or breathing to manage that discomfort, because without any discomfort, we're often again stagnant, and that should never be the goal. Allow emotional expression and not programs not punishing emotions. We heard this, I think, in the talk just before, that suppressing behaviors isn't necessarily helpful, right? The goal should never be to just suppress behaviors, because I can tell you those are the clients that end up in my office, right? It should be about learning how to navigate the challenges that are coming up. What do we do to support our body and minds? How do we utilize different resources and supports? We need to make sure that we're validating and recognizing that their feelings make sense. And the message should always be, you're allowed to feel just as you do. I often say to my clients, if I were in your body and mind, I would absolutely feel that same way. And by the way, I'm not in your body and mind, so I would never fully understand your experience, but I'm going to do the best to try and understand as closely as possible. One of the other things that I often pay attention to, this is more in the behavior terminology realm. There's a lot of focus in behavioral programs on utilizing replacement behaviors, but I think a lot of these replacement behaviors are often defined by others, and again, are coming from more of a neuronormative lens. So we should make sure that the replacement behaviors, which are helpful, are truly defined by the person, and that they're actually meeting that person's needs, interests, wants, and desires. Allowing them again to be themselves and show up in preferred ways. Then the next point is not imposing certain ways of being because someone somewhere said it was normal. We all need to remain critical of social norms designed to marginalize people on the basis of ability, gender, race, culture, class, etc. We need to make sure we're allowing for individuality and uniqueness and self-expression. Oh, how do I go back? Click too many times. Not from beginning. Sorry about this. You'd think there was an easier way. I'm sure there was. All right, sorry about that. All right, and then lastly, engaging the autistic person to identify their own skills, knowledges, and abilities. All of this means that every service is an opportunity to learn to relate to one another, where we focus on the two-way communication and interaction. A space to truly allow the client to work alongside me and me alongside them. A way that we are researching together to continuously reflect, evaluate, and take action as we continuously engage in discovery of what best supports their emotional, relational, and internal well-being. Questions?
I have a question. You mentioned about exploring individuals' autism. Just curious about some of the methods that you would use to kind of delve into that with somebody about matching them with their autism. Say, yeah, I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, so it depends on the age. I often start first with a conversation about skills and challenges. I don't usually get straight into discussion about labels, but in my first session, I do ask my clients if they have ever been given a diagnosis. I want to know what ideas they have and what labels they've already heard. Some of my clients have never even heard that term diagnosis. So then I'll say, have you ever heard somebody use a word or a phrase to describe the concerns, challenges, or problems that you're facing? I did have one client, I asked, have you ever heard labels been used? And my client said, oh yeah, one time I had a name tag with my name on it. So, sometimes I have to kind of work around how I'm trying to describe that without like giving language to it. So I'll usually have an understanding in the beginning of if they know the term autism, have they been told some other word? I get a lot of different responses, and it's really interesting. Parents tend to kind of like tense up when I ask kids in particular if they know about a diagnosis. And sometimes kids will say really funny things, and then sometimes they will spout out a bunch of diagnoses that their parents didn't realize they actually knew. But then when I'll ask things like, do you know what that means? Do you feel like you have an understanding of it? Can you tell me what that means? I get, some who have a good understanding and then some who really don't quite know. And so I first start with like, what do you understand about it? And then I go into the conversation about skills and challenges, right? That we all have different skills and challenges. We'll kind of share, if it's just myself and the client, I'll share some of my skills and challenges. They'll share some of theirs. If it's the family that's together, we'll kind of go around in a circle, again, highlighting that everybody has skills and challenges. And I usually will say that the cool thing, and I purposefully don't use the term strengths and weaknesses. This came from a narrative reading that I read years ago where they talked about when we use the term strengths, it tends to like automatically imply there are weaknesses, that it becomes a very kind of like dual understanding. And I like the idea of skills and challenges because I will often say the cool thing about challenges are that we can work on them or we can get help for them. And some things are no longer as challenging, and some of those challenges can even become skills. And some of our skills, if we don't keep those up, are no longer skills anymore. They may not necessarily become challenges. So there's a lot of defining that goes into conversations. And first kind of scaffolding some of those understandings. And then we'll start kind of connecting those skills and challenges to an understanding of autism. So sometimes I will bring out, I have like a couple different descriptions of autism from different fields that we'll kind of look through and say, what do you think? Do you agree with some of these? What kind of feel like they fit for you? With some clients, we actually get out the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, and we go through the criteria and I kind of describe what they're saying by this and do they think it fits for them or not. I'm always really cognizant of explaining that the DSM is very much deficit and impairment focused. And so that's not going to be the whole picture of what autism means. I also have a number of handouts that depict the qualities of autism, and we go through those as well. So it could take sessions where we're going through, okay, what are the challenges that you're connecting with? What are some of these qualities that you're connecting with? Okay, well, all of this might be called autism, and then what do you want to call it? And with one of my clients, it was really important that he really did not want to be connected to the term autism. And so we had a conversation about how it may be useful when trying to access services at school or trying to get support in medical settings, but that if he didn't like that term, he didn't have to use it. And we actually, because one of the things he was bringing up is that whenever he went to a psychiatrist, it was like autism, autism, autism. And so I initially had said, well, do you think you can speak up to your psychiatrist about this? And he was like, no, you don't speak up to elders. And so I went, okay, well, who can we recruit to do that for you? And so we were able to get mom to come in, and he preferred the term unique person. That's just what he wanted to think of himself as. And he had a good understanding after all of that conversation. But then he knew how he could kind of navigate different settings. And if he needed to advocate for himself, mom could speak up for him in that way. And it became very, very useful because I actually worked with him as he got into community college and then later a university. And he really needed to be able to utilize that diagnostic label to get accommodations. And by that time, he was more okay with the term, right? So it was really helpful in that regard. Sometimes we'll also find, different people that have self self-disclosed that they have autism. I try to stay away from the ones that like the world is just assuming has autism. And we might talk through like what are some of the challenges and what are some of the skills that they've, disclosed and part of their identity, and what do you connect with? So we're looking at this kind of richer definition. And then real quick, Kim, before you ask that question, I do want to mention the qualities document that I use. It's a little bit outdated. It's from 1999, but it was co-authored by Tony Atwood and Carol Gray. And I can't remember the exact name of it, but they utilize the DSM-4 diagnostic criteria for Asperger's, and they wrote it in terms of qualities. And so it's a really great document that I share a lot of times with my clients.
The question I have actually, first of all, you could have walked me right back in a lot of your presentation. You could have walked me right back through my own diagnosis. I was institutionalized, I was mismedicated. So I've been through quite a few of these hoops, and especially the time where the term Asperger's syndrome was not well known, because that's what I identify as having. You had a unique way of working with your clients that involved pictures, though. As an autistic individual, I have also actually had a lot of interaction with the deaf community as well. Is there a potential for that kind of thing to be like an area where the two communities can connect for like a diagnosis?
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of ways which many different learning styles, ways that we're perceiving the world, like we can all support one another. And in fact, I do think that the autistic community and the deaf community have learned a lot from each other. And there are many autistic and visually impaired people. So, one of the things that I think about right now, I'm only seeing clients via telehealth, and I have a couple of clients that use the closed captioning as a support tool, and it is super helpful, right? And one of my clients even said, well, I want you to put your closed captioning on so you can see what I'm seeing. And I thought that was such important feedback because I had never thought to do that, right? So I absolutely think that these are opportunities for everyone to be learning. And again, to me, it's really about dispelling these neuronormative kind of ideas and a lot of the ableism that exists. That feels like really important work. And so, there's a lot of different communities that can be contributing to this.
One more question here from online. Oh, no, okay, yeah. Great presentation. This is from Dr. Lonnie Zwagenbaum. Great presentation. Can you comment on how you approach the potential situation when the client self-identifies as being on the autism spectrum, but that is not in agreement with the full assessment?
Ooh, so that one's tricky. I think I would want to know a lot about why the person is self-identifying, what is important to them. I have found that a good amount of people that I work with self-identify first before they get an actual diagnosis from a professional. And I do think that there is something really valuable about what that person is paying attention to and what they know about themselves. Um, I have seen in my career people come through without having an autism diagnosis, even though they've been assessed 4, 5, 6 times and they have slews of other mental health diagnoses. And then they'll finally get the autism diagnosis. So I think a lot of times it's really important to understand that like our diagnostic processes, because they are based on oftentimes observable behaviors and parent report, they may not be perfect assessments. And it is really important that we're paying attention to how that person self-identifies. So I would spend a lot of time really talking with that person about what is it they're identifying with. Why is that important to them? How is it helpful? Is there any way in which it's not so helpful? Sometimes that label for some people is such a relief. I had one client who told me that after their diagnosis, they realized that they weren't broken. And it was just like such a heartwarming kind of moment to realize how important it was for somebody to go, everything I've been told about myself or all the messages I've been getting about myself, there's an explanation for that. And there's also other people like me in a community that I can connect with. So I don't want to disregard that. I definitely want to spend some time further exploring it and understanding what is it that they're noticing. I've held some criticisms about assessments because a lot of times, and we heard this earlier, a lot of times assessments are done in kind of like laboratory settings or in clinical settings, usually where it's one-on-one, there are limited distractions, and we won't always see some of the challenges come up that are otherwise in a person's life. So I would continue to assess and continue to talk with that person about how they're self-identifying. I don't know if that really clearly answers, but that's how I would approach it. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I got it.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Courtney, and to Dean for facilitation and the introduction. So we're just getting close to wrapping up our day here. The final part of our program, we're going to be moving into breakout sessions and what we have coined a mashup activity. To introduce and explain the activity, I would like to invite Planning Committee member Nessa Keshavars Mogadam.